Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 21 of Typewriter Talks. I'm Maureen McDowell, the founder and executive director of Keep St. Pete Lit. We are a literary arts organization based in St. Petersburg, Florida. And today we have with us Maria Mora. Did I do it right? It's like a tongue twister.
It is. It's tough.
She's a young adult writer, and she's also on Keep St. Pete Lit's board, and we've had other board members here, but we are lucky to have such wonderful writers on our team. So, Maria, tell us what you're working on right now.
Oh gosh, I'm actually working on a manuscript. I'm deep in revisions on another young adult fantasy that I'm hoping that I'll wrap up revisions on in October and be able to get that over to my literary agent, and she'll give me some more notes. But we're hoping to go out with it in January, which would be great. Wrapping up a picture book manuscript right now as well. And then as soon as I turn that in, I've got to work on revisions on another young adult book from October to the end of the year. So it's kind of ongoing forever.
Your next book comes out in March.
Yes, my young adult debut, Fragile Remedy, comes out in March 2021. So it's funny when people ask, are you working on your book? It's been in the can for so long that it's a kind of an afterthought. I've actually turned in all my final edits. The book was originally supposed to come out in June of this year, but the release was moved about 11 months because of the pandemic. So we're finished with production. The neat silver lining there is that now we will have an audiobook that's currently in production. So I love that for accessibility. And I have a lot of pals who read audiobooks, listen to audiobooks. So that will come out concurrently with the paperback in March 2021. So that is a neat little silver lining to having a delay.
Yeah. Do you think you'll do audiobooks going forward with all your books if you can?
It's absolutely up to the publisher. So I don't have any say in that. I hope so. I really think it's great for people who have visual disability or just prefer to put on an audiobook while they clean the house. I actually have a very hard time with auditory processing or with audiobooks. So I don't listen to them, but I have many, many friends who exclusively do. And I think it's really neat. So it would be amazing to have that opportunity, but it's typically very out of an author's hands, whether or not those rights get sold. They're sold very separately than the hardcover or paperback rights, and separately as well, foreign rights.
Yeah, it's like I have so many friends that love podcasts, and I just can't get into it. And people are like, you got to make Typewriter Talks podcasts, and I'm like, I want to see the person I'm talking to. I'll be more engaged.
Yeah.
Watch how it's like having somebody across from you. You can watch their mannerisms and how they, as Bob Evan Jones says, occur in the world. So
I love that. I do listen to some podcasts, but I listened to them on my commute. So I pretty much cold turkey stopped listening to podcasts in March. So I'm going to have a hell of a backlog if I get back to the few that I was regularly listening to, because I don't find the time to. But audiobooks are especially hard because my mind wanders, and then I realize I've missed big chunks of the story, and so it's tough.
So what drew you to young adult fiction? Fantasy.
Yeah, I primarily write fantasy. I don't know. I think that I love the passion and big feelings that teenagers have. And I really relate to that. I also really enjoy reading a lot of YA, especially YA fantasy. It typically has a little bit of romance, but not too much. There's a misconception, I guess, that YA is more simple than adult fiction. And it's typically not, especially fantasy, especially high fantasy, which mine is not, but your more high fantasy YA books are actually pretty complicated. But I like the sense of transformation that you find in YA. So typically, someone starts the book in a certain place in their lives, age and maturity wise, and what's happening in their life, and they end the story having become a very different person through the circumstances of the book, and then just naturally through aging, maturing. And I think that that's just a really cool dynamic to explore in YA. And it can be explored, I think, in sometimes like an issue book, you know, where it's like, oh, this person learned this life lesson. That's not really my jam. I just like to throw as much terrible stuff at them as possible and see where they come out on the other side, which I think is a lot of fun to play with. So yeah, I mean, I think it's just being a fan, honestly. I didn't read YA as a teen. I kind of jumped right into like Stephen King. I was reading Outlander in 6th grade, which now I look back and I'm like, oh boy,
yeah, I was
pretty grown up. Yeah, pretty grown up. But I didn't read a ton of books that were written for teens. And so I think I picked up Twilight, to be honest, and then the Hunger Games. And of course, Harry Potter. I did read the Harry Potter books, but in terms of the kind of YA as we know it, I think Twilight, a friend of mine was like, pick up this book. I know it's marketed to teens.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is so fun. Like, this is really just like a blast. And then the Hunger Games, of course, I was like, are we allowed to do this? We can murder kids in books? Wow.
Yeah.
You really can. And so that really opened that door up to me. I don't know that I would have thought I can be a young adult author. But especially seeing stories that were dark, just really, truly quite dark, because I tend to gravitate that way. I think I wouldn't have realized that I could if that kind of stuff wasn't out there. I would have naturally been like, oh, we can't say these things to the kids. You know, we're going to freak them out.
Being a teenager. I mean, that's
no. And you know, the books like An Ember in the Ashes, for example, the whole Ember series is like just almost too much for me, a grown-up lady. Like, it's so dark, it's so violent. You know, it would be like an R-rated film if it was an R-rated film, but kids love it. And I think it's the content that they're looking for is like, take me, a teenager, and then just blow it up. Yeah. Most extreme possible situations that I could be in. And it's pretty neat to see.
Eleanor and Park is one of my favorite books.
Yeah, I have not read it.
Related to that book.
I don't read a ton of contemporary stories.
Interesting. So what are some of your themes in your books?
That's a really great question. Found family, so a sense of kind of surrounding yourself with a chosen family is a theme that comes out quite often in my writing. Kind of exploring toxic friendships sometimes and what that means, and so the moral gray areas between right and wrong and good and evil. I really gravitate towards that space. Mm-hmm. Another thing that I tend to gravitate to is challenging what you've always been told is the truth. So maybe discovering that that was a lie, or discovering that you haven't been curious enough, or you haven't asked enough questions to kind of challenge the status quo. That's often a theme that comes out. And a little bit of romance. Two of the kind of 3 books that are floating around either in different levels of production or this book have, you know, a romance subplot. It's definitely not in the forefront, but I do love a good swoony bit of romance and an adventure story. Mm-hmm.
So you have a full-time job and you have 2 boys. What is a typical day for you, like as a writer? What's the writing process?
You know, it depends. So there's really two modes: drafting or revising. Mm-hmm. So if I'm drafting a new project, I try to hit 500 words a day, 5 or 6 days a week. And 500 words is very fast for me. So that's sort of the bare minimum. If I'm having a bad day, fine, I'll get 500 words down. I usually average closer to 1,200 to 1,500 words when I'm drafting in a writing session. I use Scrivener. That's my word processor of choice. I love it. And it has some really great tracking where this like bar goes from red to orange to green as you progress throughout the day and or throughout your writing session. So it's motivating to make it turn green.
Yeah.
I'm really motivated by things like stickers and colors. I write in the evenings when I'm drafting. Occasionally on weekends, I might start earlier. I wish I was a person who got up at 5 and wrote in the morning. A lot of my friends do. I'm just not a nice person in the morning, and it's just not, it doesn't come through for me. So I'll typically write, you know, it's become earlier. It used to, when my kids were really little, it was like 8 down on, they would go to sleep at 8. Now they're teenagers and they don't want to talk to me or interact with me at all. So I can usually start a little earlier when they're doing their homework or whatever they're doing that they don't want to talk to me. So that opens up a little bit more time. And I put music on, I have to have music on, and just kind of grind, you know, till I'm done. And so drafting, when I'm drafting, I'm thinking, I hate this and I can't wait to get to revising. And when I'm revising, I'm like, I hate this. I wish I was drafting a new project. Revision mode, similar timing, similar setup, evenings, music, but it's much harder to track progress because you could spend all night on one page, or you could hit a really solid run that you had and you could get many pages done because you didn't really screw it up that badly. You could delete a bunch of stuff. So I struggle emotionally a little bit more in that revision stage because I don't feel like I have a visual on my progress, or I don't feel like I'm being productive, even though I am. I have a sticky note on my other computer. I write down the numbers of the chapters. So the book I'm on right now is 26 chapters. And I literally just cross one off as I go on a sticky note or on whatever. And that feels a little bit rewarding progress tracking wise. But that's it. In the evenings, like you said, I'm VP of creative and content strategy at a marketing agency. I work full time. I'm a single mom. So I don't write during the day. And on weekends, I don't typically write during the day either. Try to save that time for it at night. So I'll go through multiple months where I'm not watching TV. People are like, did you watch this show? And I'm like, I don't have a life. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know where the remote is. And then when I'm done, I'll like binge the shit out of a bunch of stuff because
I'm in a binge mode right now.
Watch TV. I want to be there.
I'm totally into Gossip Girl.
Oh, that was good stuff. Talk about YA.
Yeah.
I mean, Gossip Girl set the stage for a lot of great.
I'm addicted and I'm like, oh my God, I have so much stuff I want to do, but it's just sometimes I'm just trusting it's because I'm in a transition period.
Yeah. And you know, that's the invisible work of writing. You cannot grind all the time. You cannot. Your stories will be flat and you'll burn out. But there's a lot of important work that happens in the life that you live in between the times that you get in front of your computer. So all work, all living contributes to the output. And I think it's really important for authors to prioritize whatever downtime looks like for them. Travel, I mean, I know right now we don't really travel anymore, but travel has a huge impact on my writing. And I hear from many other author friends, whether it's like, oh, wow, you know, I'm going to set a whole book in this location because I was so charmed by it, or just discovering a new food or a new culture. All of those things make what you write so much richer. So I count that as the work, you know. I don't know if I count like massages, but I would like to also count them.
I count swimming laps and massages.
Yeah.
I mean, I actually count swimming laps as part of my workday because I work out so much stuff.
Yeah.
Like if
That's
I have
awesome.
By like lap 10, I've worked it out. And it's
that's great. That's how I am in the shower.
Yeah.
I should swim laps, but I just take showers occasionally and then I get ideas.
A friend of mine, Paula, her name's escaping me. She's a choreographer and she gets all of her ideas in the shower.
So there's some brain science behind that. It's the roteness of the activity, but actually the white noise as well of the water. So there's a few contributing factors that open your mind up to thought patterns that you don't follow when you're doing other things. So there's some really, if you look it up, there's some cool brain science. And I don't know, I also get a lot of ideas when I'm driving. And especially if I have music on. So music, the way a song makes me feel, not necessarily what it's about, will often trigger kind of an emotional thread in a story. So you never know. You just don't know when things are going to blossom.
When you're get an idea for a story, does it come from the idea or do you hear the characters' voices? Or is it just the theme?
Usually I get a little snippet of a person. It's
Okay.
like they're a shadow person, but I know a few things about them emotionally. Maybe something they're afraid of or something they want. Don't know their name usually. And then I kind of get a feeling of the way that they feel about another person. And then it's sort of like um, ripples on water after that. You kind of push it and see, okay, all right. Um, and then that'll typically expand, the world just expands around that. But I start at the heart typically with like, oh, who are you? You know, you just popped up because this song made me feel a thing. And now we're going to see where it goes. It's not a very disciplined approach, but it does involve a lot of ideas that just get thrown away. But then one lands and you just sort of like expand on it after that.
You mentioned earlier that you hate writing and you hate revising, but
Mm-hmm.
you are a writer. Like you have, with a full-time job and being a single parent of two boys, like you have every distraction in the world to not write. So why do you write?
I mean, honestly, Maureen, I ask myself that a lot. And I tell, it does feel like a compulsion sometimes. I think I would be sad if I didn't. Um, I find it very rewarding to elicit an emotional response in a reader.
Mm.
So that closing the loop eventually becomes a carrot. It's really tough in traditional publishing. I started Fragile Remedy in 2012, 8 years ago. So that's a pretty slow burn to get the payoff in March
Yeah.
2021. Um, so that, even if I have one kind of zero draft reader, one really early reader, even sharing it with somebody can be motivating to me in that, because I do ultimately, I want to make somebody feel something. I wanted them to tell me that they felt something. So there is a sense of like intimacy in that. Um, I've always written, I've always really been drawn to telling stories or feeling things about stories. So it just kind of naturally fell into place. But it is really, really hard. It is really hard work. In traditional publishing, it's extremely lonely work as well. You can and should surround yourself with writer pals, but ultimately, there's many, many hours spent in your head by yourself in front of your computer, toiling away on something that may or may not pan out. And so I don't know, I guess it's a calling in that sense, because I could spend all day telling you all the reasons why I shouldn't do it anymore. And yet, here I am doing the thing. So it is what it is. I, in the best times, I think I'm pretty good at it. So there's that sense of accomplishment and satisfaction as well. I'm like, that was a pretty good sentence. It's like 3% that was really good, and then like 97% this is shit. This is garbage, But the more I talk to other writers, the more I feel that is a pretty universal sense. That, and I think it's kind of healthy yet unhealthy. It's normal. I think people who think their writing is flawless probably wouldn't write things that would appeal to me personally,
Yeah.
maybe.
I'm reading James Baldwin right now. We're reading Another Country for our book club with the Studio 620, and I'm just like, it almost makes me want to be like, just quit, you know?
Oh yeah, it's
So,
tough.
I'm just
Yeah.
like, whoa. But I think that, but then I'm feeling so inspired. Like earlier today, like, I'm in a Gossip Girl rabbit hole. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah, yeah.
kind of like burned out and need to just regroup. But then to like pick up a book that
Mm-hmm.
just like, I mean, I can feel my life changing reading this book. Like
That's so cool.
I can feel the air differently. The air is different.
Yeah,
It's just
that's
like,
so great.
I know that's really the power of literature. And it was
Yeah,
written in 1960 by an African American gay man. Like we're two totally, different time periods,
yeah,
worlds, but his words just like still resonate,
that's so cool.
so
That's
current.
so cool.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
that's what I think, like that possibly is what keeps us, writing.
yeah, yeah,
And if you're a reader, like you want to, make a little bit of a dent on the world, maybe.
yeah, yeah. I just, for me, I write things I would have wanted to read as
Yeah.
a teenager. I write things I want to read now as an adult. And again, it's to elicit an emotional response. So sometimes even in myself, like I want to build to that moment of catharsis or relief or happiness or sadness. There's, there's sad stuff in all my books. But it's like a safe framework in order to feel things and come out the other side alive and okay.
Yeah.
And that was really important to me. I think that when we talk about literature, we can kind of sometimes lose sight of escapism as a totally valuable thing, especially for kids. It's okay. It's okay to not have a super deep theme. It's okay if the whole point was that for 6 hours, the reader didn't think about other things in their life that they didn't want to think about. And that's why, I love that you're talking about Gossip Girl, because I think there's so much value in media that's traditionally for teenage girls. It typically gets kind of shit on for not having value, where you look at Game of Thrones, like you could also make an argument that that's crap. It's like a soap opera with more, boobs and blood, but ultimately the narrative beats are really, really similar. And so I'm a big fan of like, let girls like shit, don't shit on them for it. There's huge value. And so YA as a genre, much like romance, they both tend to be like, over there, the stuff for the teenagers and the stuff for the girls. And, there's tremendous value in that writing, I think. And romance is really hard. Like there is a formula to it, but it's a tough, you have to feel and understand things, I think, to pull it off. I have a lot of respect for romance writers and a ton of respect for the rapport they develop with their readerships. I think they really get to know their audience and kind of get to know like what makes them feel and cater to that. That's a really special relationship. So it's kind of a cool thing. I don't write, I have romance threads. I don't write romance novels, and I kind of wish I could. It seems like a superpower.
Yeah. Yeah. We had Tamara Lush on here, and she writes for the AP during the day. And then she's now moving into what are called cozy mysteries, but she's
so good.
Like serial romance novels. She'll put a little bit out, and she's actually paid to put content out. And,
That's so cool.
Yeah. And that you can keep something fresh. The exchanges between two people that, that's another thing. Like every movie I've watched every romance movie there is. Like I've watched, and it's the same formula. It's like 10 minutes before it ends, they're going to break up. And then it's the same formula, but every single time I rewatch them. Like I watch the same ones over and over again sometimes, and it's just like, what I think what you're saying is like, you want to feel.
You want to feel, absolutely.
You want to feel something, in this rushy, deadening world in a lot of ways. It's magic. It's magic. You want to feel a part of the magic, and you crave it,
Yeah.
So,
that's why I'm actually a big fan of transformative works as well, which is a really fancy academic way of saying fan fiction. But I love the idea of transformative works are becoming a little bit more mainstream. And that's readers and other creators taking something that made them feel and then feeling again and again and again. Like, I'm going to take that beat that made me feel a thing and I'm going to expand on it. I'm going to put a twist on it, or I'm going to create representation of something that I didn't feel I was represented enough, or, they screwed up. I'm going to fix it. Like, there's a million wonderful elements to that. And it's all about, again, eliciting a feeling and feeling and feeling. And I just think it's so cool and such an awesome sandbox too for writers, especially younger writers. I spoke to this middle schooler, and she's writing on Wattpad, which I was very concerned about because I feel like it's a little bit too grown up for the age that she was. But she was like, how do you deal with criticism? People are trolling me and being so mean. And I'm like, stop putting your stuff on the internet. You're a baby. But it's still, she's going to be a great writer by the time she's 18 or 19. She's a total trial by fire. She's going to not care about her mean Goodreads reviews. But what a cool sandbox. Anytime writers start early because they're writing fan fiction, I'm like, you do it, man. That's a way to go. Every word is a good word. Every word helps you grow.
That's what Tamara writes for Wattpad, and she's actually one of the few paid writers for it. And she says that she loves the negative comments because it helps her grow as a writer. And
interesting.
about like where you don't want to lose your reader, and if you've lost your readers, if you take that feedback and say, oh, maybe I need to tweak this a little, or, oh, okay, yeah. So
that's so interesting. I'm very against writers. I mean, she can, obviously it's helping her, but as a whole, I think that you have to have a certain level of expertise to provide constructive criticism to writers. So every reader is like, oh, I hate that word or whatever. And to really grow, I think writers need to learn from other writers or professional editors.
yeah,
And typically the kind of like the crowd, so to speak, they're coming at it from, did you or did you not satisfy my specific needs? What I personally hoped to feel or gain from reading this piece of work? Well, that's tough because you could have 50 people all give you a completely different direction. Now, if you've got 50 comments and they're all like, listen, same thing, like I hated this one thing that happened, maybe there's something to learn from there. But you know, typically, you know, once a book has been published, for example, you know, authors are typically discouraged from reading the comments because or the Goodreads reviews, whatever that is, because the criticism is only about the reader's experience and relationship with the work. It's not necessarily an objective perspective on the quality of the writing or the story beats or the narrative or anything at all. So it's interesting that I very rarely hear the perspective that she has. So it's pretty cool that it's working for her. I would absolutely not read comments on Wattpad. They would not be helpful to me.
yeah. Well,
I would hate it.
everybody's different. That's the thing that
Yeah.
was actually surprising to me to hear. But she also writes for the AP, and so she's used to editors.
She's got thick skin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, 2 more questions. What would you tell your younger writer self?
My younger writer self, not other young. Oh, jeez.
No.
I don't know. Wow.
What advice would you give yourself? Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. Just keep, you know, it's funny because, you know, I don't prescribe to the idea of like fixing things. So I don't know that I would change anything. It took me a long time to think I could write a novel length work. So, you know, maybe I would say like, hey, you're going to have a book published. But even then, I think the young me would have been like, what? No, it's too hard. Leave me alone. You know, everybody has a timeline that they're on. You know, for me as a 40-year-old with a young adult debut, I'm older than a lot of the young adult debuts. But you know, there are plenty of successful authors who started their careers in their 40s and 50s. I spent my whole entire 30s writing. I spent all of my 20s writing, and that's the only way I got to where I am now. So, you know, telling younger me, it was what I would tell the teenagers I talk to, which is every bit of writing that you do is a means to not an end, but just growth. So, you know, I'll tell kids, journal about your day, write a fanfic, you know, bitch about your mom, like whatever you want to say, those words count. And try not to hate your school assignments as much as you do, because those words are really helpful too. Writing to spec, writing to someone else's kind of specifications of what they need is something that you need to learn how to do so that you can then break those rules. But all of that writing is great. The shit that you delete is great. All of it helps you grow.
I actually have another question more than I haven't. What are you reading right now? Like, who are some of your favorite authors, and what are you reading right now?
Some of my favorite authors. What am I reading right now? I just finished The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune, which was an adult book. I don't read a lot of adult books. I really, really enjoyed it though. And it had a kind of a Howl's Moving Castle feel to it, or Hitchhiker's Guide, or Umbrella Academy, or things I've seen compared to it. So even though it was adult fiction, it was really light and a fun, easy read. I really like V.E. Schwab's fantasy books, A Darker Shade of Magic series. I'm not currently reading them, but they really stand out to me as like kind of a paragon of dark YA fantasy. I'm really excited for Saba Tahir's new book. She wrote Ember in the Ashes, and I'm forgetting the name of the fourth one, but I think it comes out this fall. And those are an absolute blast. I really, really like Naomi Novik. everything she writes, but she's somebody that I cannot read when I'm working because she's so goddamn good that I'm like, I'm out. Spending Silver was fantastic. Uprooted is one of my favorite novels. And so I tend to stick in that fantasy. I really like the Bear and the Nightingale series recently as well. Those are adult fantasy. I love Beauty and the Beast retellings. I'm like, that seems problematic, but I love them. That's my truth. And that's another one. It's like a Russian folklore inspired Beauty and the Beast retelling. I enjoyed the shit out of it. It was a trilogy and I blasted through it pretty quickly. But that all to say, I'm not currently reading anything. I totally don't read when I'm in the middle of revisions because I'm a sponge and I'm like afraid I'm gonna soak up someone else's style or I'm gonna despair myself into quitting. So I look forward to turning this in and then maybe grabbing something off my shame shelf, which is like the 37 books I've purchased that are waiting for me.
Shelf?
My shame shelf. My shame. It just stares at me like, wow, bitch, you spent like $300 on us, but you're not reading any of us.
Yeah.
There's a Wicked Saints. I'm really excited to read Emily Duncan's second book in her, I think it's going to be a trilogy. So Ruthless Gods, Wicked Saints was the first one. I have Ruthless Gods, and I'm really excited to dive in and read that. So I have a lot of things on my shelf. For some reason, I'm blanking on all of them.
Good.
But yeah, I mean, pretty much YA fantasy is where it's at typically for me, or sometimes adult fantasy with some light romance. Those are kind of my jams, which, you know, is interesting because Fragile Remedy is like light sci-fi, but I don't feel like it had a ton of literary influences, probably more cinematic influences in terms of dystopian films like Waterworld, which is a terrible film, but the vibe of it,
yeah, the visuals of Waterworld.
The visuals were gorgeous. Not a great movie. Kevin Costner's really bad in it, but the visuals and then just the feeling of scrappy people. Same with like Mad Max Fury Road actually came out way after I had originally drafted this book, but it kind of also has that vibe of like people creatively surviving. I think it's much grittier.
No, it reminds me of Star Wars. I'm just getting references of like with Luke Skywalker living on, you know, in the desert. Yeah. I remember being a child seeing that where he lived and how just like to living in Florida and how different, you know, that there's something that just draws you about something that's so different than what you're used to. That's why Waterworld is just wild, you know?
Right. And I loved, as a child reader before YA, but the survival story is really my diehard most favorite genre. It's starting with the Boxcar Children. So the Boxcar Children is pretty light. They're not like imminently facing death, but they live in this abandoned rail car and they kind of like, oh, we built a little kitchen and like, we've got to go find shit in the woods. And any kind of story like that, Hatchet. There was a book called The Island Keeper, is a chapter book that I really loved about a girl who didn't want to go do something. So she went to this abandoned island and she, like her boat sank or something. So she was just stuck there having to learn how to survive. So any of that, I think I kind of took the spirit of that because Fragile Remedy at its core is this gang of young scavengers and they're living kind of off the grid and having to survive in an urban landscape. But it's the same tone, which to me, I just love is like, how do we scrap together lives for, I forgot how to do words, but it's, you know, how do we survive, but also find joy in simple things and in each other? And what do we learn about ourselves when we are cut down to survival mode?
COVID's done that a bit.
not
really survival mode, but it's really cut us down to like the bare bones of, in a lot of ways, of like, you know, who's in your immediate reality and who are you hanging out with. And
absolutely. It's tough. Fragile Remedy takes place about 20 years after a pandemic.
Oh wow.
Disease. And that was part of the reason we pushed the launch. It's not a heavy plot point because it is many years later, but I was like, oh my God, I manifested this.
I have another writer that said the same thing about a book that she's actually currently writing. She's like,
Yeah.
manifest this?
Yeah. I mean, I did it a long time ago, guys. Sorry, it was 2012, but you know, it's interesting. You know, and we may end up putting author's notes in the beginning along those lines. Like, this was written in 2012. You know, wasn't planning to have any parallels to our world right now. It's pretty bleak, though. I don't think we're going to get to that bleak level. We're okay.
All right, one last question, promise.
Okay.
What is your holy grail piece of writing advice?
Oh, these are really hard questions. Holy grail piece of writing advice is just to read, you know, read as widely as you can. I don't take that advice that well because I am such an indulgent, self-indulgent reader. Like when I have the time with all the other things going on in my life, I typically don't stretch myself as hard as I should. And it's like always a thing that's weighing on me. Like you need to stretch into all these different genres, but I tend to reach for what I know for a fact will be comforting. Margaret Rogerson, Sorcery of Thorns. I'm gonna recommend that. There, I remembered another book. Sorcery of Thorns to me is an example of a YA fantasy that I just find to be super comforting. It has tropes that I know, like, oh, this is probably gonna happen. That's great. And I'm gonna love that when that happens. So I tend to read, but I think when you read something you like, you do learn those patterns. You know, you subconsciously learn the beats, and you need to know the beats because you cannot reinvent story beats. They've all been relatively the same since humans could talk to each other. But I mean, just read. You learn so much. And you know, it might sound, that advice might sound like, oh, you need to read so you can copy things, but I don't think that that's what happens. I think that your vocabulary expands. I think that you take everything you've read and you develop a voice of your own, but you can't really develop that voice in a vacuum. So, you know, reading early and often, it really helps you get there.
Wow, thank you. So let's hear some of your work.
I love that. And so I say that semi-sarcastically. So this is Fragile Remedy again. It comes out March 9th. And I've never read any of it out loud before. So I mean, I read some of it out loud when I was proofreading it, but I got a sore throat. I couldn't read the whole damn book. So I didn't read much of it out loud, actually. And I was a person who didn't really enjoy reading books out loud to my kids. I did, but I never enjoyed it. I hate my own voice and I hate reading. So
I love your voice.
Thanks, Maureen. I'm going to start a little bit into the first chapter.
Okay.
So just a little bit in there. All right. Nate skirted a tent city, crowded in the bombed out shell of a building. Some days, the people who lived there got fired up and strung out on chem and hurled rocks at the passing trains. It was quiet today, colorful tarps sighing in the breeze. A handful of servants in drab robes walked from tent to tent, murmuring prayers in hushed tones and asking after those frail with age and sickness. Nate had always been fascinated by them. They believed in the old gods, a mythology that, for most, had long been overtaken by science, by the things people did to each other with no help from the makers of the world. He longed for the simplicity of believing in something good. He'd seen too much of the bad to have faith. Still, the servants intrigued him. They alone gave aid to the sick and the suffering and the withers. Those who were chosen by the servants to join their ranks left behind their families and vowed to care for those who could not care for themselves. They lived together in sick dens, helping anyone they could. Feeling one of their gazes, Nate ducked his head automatically. Attention was rarely a good thing in the withers, and he'd learned a long time ago to stay small and quiet. A short servant with white hands and a face hidden by her hood stopped to watch him stumble along. She continued to study him too closely, and he let his hair fall into his face and hurried off, wary of questions. When he glanced over his shoulder, she was still watching him, her face shadowed by her hood. Whatever she thought she had to offer, it didn't matter. Servants' prayers and salves could not help him. Two scrawny children chased a chewed-up plastic ball around in the mud and paused, watching Nate warily as he shuffled by. He offered a wave and earned a pair of scowls. A grin tugged at his dry lips. They were smart to be suspicious. It would keep them alive longer. Nate approached the bustling heart of the Withers. The quarantine island had once been known as Winter Heights, the largest of the chain of islands that dotted the wide sludge channel that ran through Gathos City. Here, in the oldest neighborhood on the decaying island, the musical sound of voices echoed between crooked buildings. Nate crammed into a narrow alley, avoiding the crowded main street, his boots squelching through muck and filth on the pavement. It wasn't easy going, but at least he wouldn't get flattened by a train or trampled. He shook with exhaustion and braced himself against a rough brick wall to catch his breath. The smell of rendered fat overtook the alley's musty stench. His stomach grumbled, but he knew better than to fall for the oily scent of grease. Most street meat in the Withers was a mixture of guts and gravel. And he couldn't eat until he sold the gang's haul and picked up enough food for all of them to share. He might have enough time. The sun winked down at him between the slats of rusty fire escapes. As long as he kept this pace, he could make it to Alden's for remedy and over to the market before sundown. He wouldn't be able to sell the fishing line there, but he could sell the rest. Dal's words itched at him. He'd never liked the common prayer, "God's watched you." Nate wanted to believe in the old gods, ancient makers of thunder and dirt and blood, according to servants and old folks. But he knew where he came from. Not from the jeweled deep sea or the tall trees that had once stood against the storms that battered the islands of Gathos in the summer. Not from the gray sky or the green shadows of dusk. Not dropped from the beak of a fat gull, the way children sang when they pointed at the birds that rode the smog breezes high overhead. In the Withers, babies were plenty, and died plenty too.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for sharing.
You're welcome.
In this story, I'm like, I love the word, the Withers, and then the servants, and it's like so visual. I'm like, oh, the remedy. What's the remedy?
I'm glad. Good.
Thank you, Maria. You gave us
You're welcome.
points. The reason we do this is to kind of get in the heads of writers and see everybody has a different process. There's not one way to be a writer. Thank you for championing young adult fiction and fan fiction and all the, what's considered the lower forms of literature, which I don't agree with those terms, high, low forms,
right,
or the hierarchy and all that stuff. So thank you. And thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes. So please join us next Tuesday for episode 22 of Typewriter Talks. We are Keep St. Pete Lit. If you like what you see, you can go to our website, keepstpetelit.org, and we appreciate donations to keep this program going. And once again, thank you, Maria, and thank you everyone for watching. See you next week.